Bourgogne's Memoirs of Sergeant Bourgogne, 1812-1813, offer a personal account of his experiences during Napoleon's Russian campaign. As a sergeant in the Imperial Guard, Bourgogne describes the harsh realities faced by the French soldiers. Let's begin. Considering my deplorable condition, I felt it would be impossible to walk further without changing my clothes. It may be remembered that in the portmanteau found on the mountain of Ponary, I had some shirts and white cotton breeches, clothes belonging to an army commissary. Having opened my knapsack, I drew out a shirt and hung it on my musket, then the breeches, which I placed beside me on the tree. I took off my jacket and overcoat and my waistcoat with the quilted yellow silk sleeves that I had made out of a Russian lady's skirt at Moscow. I untied the shawl which was wrapped round my body and my trousers fell about my heels. As for my shirt, I had not the trouble of taking it off, for it had neither back nor front. I pulled it off in shreds, and there I was, naked, except for a pair of wretched boots, in the midst of a wild forest, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, with 18 to 20 degrees of cold, for the north wind had begun to blow hard again. On looking at my emaciated body, dirty and consumed with vermin, I could not restrain my tears. At last, summoning the little strength that remained, I set about my toilet. With snow and the rags of my old shirt, I washed myself to the best of my power. Then I drew on my new shirt of fine long cloth, embroidered down the front. I got into the little calico breeches as quickly as I could, but I found them so short that even my knees were not covered, and my boots only reaching halfway up my leg. All this part was bare. Finally, I put on my yellow silk waistcoat, my riding jacket, my overcoat, over this my belt and collar, and there I was, completely attired, except for my legs. After this, I got down from my tree trunk, and going 100 steps or so, I caught sight of 2 people, a man and a woman, and I recognized that they were Germans. They seemed to be frightened. I asked them if they would like to come with me. But in a trembling voice, the man answered no, and pointing in the direction of the road, he uttered the single word, Cossack. They were a canteen man and his wife, belonging to the Rhine Confederation, probably one of the Kono garrison who were following up the retreat, and being like myself surprised in the forest by the noise, had taken to flight. The woman advised her husband to join me, but the man would not consent, and in spite of all I could say to him, I was obliged, to my regret, to go on alone. After having wandered haphazard for about half an hour, I stopped to take my bearings, for night was coming on. In this part of the forest, there was a great deal of snow. Neither track, nor beaten road, nor even a trace of one. Sometimes I sat down to rest upon trees lying uprooted by the great winds. I had to grasp at the twigs of the bushes in fear of falling, I was so weak. My legs were buried in the snow above my boots, so that they got filled. However, I was not cold. On the contrary, drops of sweat fell down my face, but my legs refused to carry me. In consequence of the efforts I was making to drag myself out of the snow, in which I sank often up to my knees, I felt an extraordinary lassitude in my thighs. I will not attempt to describe what I suffered. For more than an hour I was walking in the dark, lighted only by the stars. Not succeeding in getting out of the forest at that point, nearest to the road, and able to do no more, exhausted, breathless, I resolved to rest. I propped myself up against the trunk of a tree and remained motionless. A moment afterwards I heard a dog barking. I looked in the direction of the sound and saw a light shining. Sighing hopefully, and summoning all the strength I had, I turned towards this new quarter. But 30 paces further on were 4 horses, and seated around a fire, 4 Cossacks. 3 peasants were there too. Amongst them were the canteen man and his wife, whom I had met, taken no doubt by those Cossacks who had wanted to make off with me. I easily recognized the one with the saber cut across the face, for I was not 20 steps away. I watched them for some time, wondering if it would not be better to go and give myself up, rather than die like a brute in the midst of the wood. The light of the fire tempted me, but for some unknown reason I did the exact opposite and drew back. Still I watched them and noticed that several earthen pots were around the fire. They had straw to lie on, and the horses had hay to eat. The number of trees made it impossible for me to follow the exact direction I wished to take. I was obliged to bear to the left, fortunately for me, for after taking a few steps, I found the forest clearer, but the snow in greater quantities, so that I fell several times. One last time I rose and reproached God for my misfortunes, who was yet watching over me. I now found myself at the end of the forest and on the high road. There I fell upon my knees and thanked him against whom I had just rebelled. I walked straight on. The road was good, and no doubt the right one. But the wind, which I had not felt in the forest, was too keen for my bare legs. My coat, being long, kept off a little of the cold. Oddly enough, I was not hungry. I do not know whether the excitement I had been through since the Cossacks' attack were the cause, or if it were the effect of my sickness. But since leaving the stable, where I had had some soup and meat, I had no desire to eat. However, fancying that there ought to be a piece of meat still left in my bag, I searched for it, and was lucky enough to find it, and although hardened by the frost, I ate it as I went along. My meal over, I raised my head and saw two men on horseback on my left, apparently advancing with caution. And further on, along the road, was a man who seemed to be getting along better than I was. I doubled my pace to join him, but all at once he disappeared. Looking to the left, I caught sight of a little hut and went in. But hardly was I inside when I heard the click of a musket and a deep voice said, "Who goes there?" "A friend," I answered, and added, "A soldier of the Imperial Guard." Ah, came the answer. "Where the devil do you come from, comrade, that I haven't met you while I've been walking all alone?" I related to him a part of what had happened to me since the Cossacks' attack, of which he knew nothing. We resumed our march. I saw that my new comrade was an old chasseur of the guard, and that he carried on his knapsack and around his neck a pair of cloth trousers that apparently were of no use to him, but could be of the greatest benefit to me. I begged him to let me buy them of him, and showed him the naked state of my legs. "My poor comrade," he said, "I would willingly oblige you if I could, but I must tell you that the trousers are burnt in several places and are full of great holes." "Never mind that, let me have them, they may perhaps save my life." He pulled them off his knapsack, saying, "Take them." Then I took 2 5-franc pieces from my bag, asking him if it was enough. "Quite," he answered. "Make haste and let us be off, for I see 2 men on horseback coming down this way. They may be Cossack scouts." While he was speaking, I had put on the trousers. I kept them in place, as I had the former ones, with the shawl wrapped around my body, and we set off. We hadn't taken 100 steps before my companion, who walked faster than I did, was already 20 yards in front of me. I saw him stoop and pick something up. At first I couldn't distinguish what it was, but coming to the spot I saw a dead man, and recognized him as a grenadier of the Royal Dutch Guard that, from the beginning of the campaign, had formed part of the Imperial Guard. He had neither knapsack nor bear skin, but he still had his musket, cartridge pouch, saber, and great black gaiters on his legs, reaching above the knee. I took the gaiter and put them over my trousers to cover the holes. Then I set off walking again, rather faster than usual, as if the dead man were running after me. Meanwhile the chasseur had gone on, and I could not see him. Soon afterwards I came to a great building, and recognizing it as a posting house, I made up my mind to pass the night there. An infantry soldier, the sentinel, called out, "Who goes there?" "A friend," I answered and entered. The first thing I saw was about 30 men, some of them sleeping, others cooking horseflesh and rice, round several fires. To the right were 3 men, sitting round a bowl of rice. I sank down beside them. After a moment, I tried to speak to one of them, pulling him by his coat. He looked at me without a word. Then, in a piteous tone, I said, in a low voice, that the others might not hear, "Comrade, I entreat you, let me eat some spoonfuls of rice. I will pay you. You will do me a great service. You will save my life." At the same time, I offered him 2 pieces of 5 francs, which he took, saying, "Eat." He handed me a spoon and an earthenware plate, and also gave up his place near the fire. For my 10 francs, there were about 15 spoonfuls of rice still left. I looked about me when I had eaten to see if the old chasseur were there. I discovered him near a hérac, busy cutting up a bear skin to make ear lappets of. This bear skin belonged to the Dutch grenadier. He had picked it up when I saw him stoop. I went over to him to rest, but hardly was I stretched on the straw when the sentinel exclaimed, "Look out!" saying that he had caught sight of Cossacks. Immediately everybody jumped up and seized their arms. A shout was heard, "A friend! Frenchman!" 2 cavalrymen enter the barn and dismounting show themselves. But several began questioning them, in particular the old chasseur, who said, "How is it you are on horseback and dressed like a Cossack?" "Probably to rob and pillage our sick and wounded." "Nothing of the sort," replied one of the 2 troopers. "When you see us, you will believe it. We can prove it, and when we are settled, we will tell you all about it." The speaker, after having tied up the 2 horses and given them some straw, of which there was plenty in the barn, returned to his companion, who seemed to walk with difficulty, and taking him by the arm, led him up to a place beside me. After eating some bread and drinking brandy, and having also given a pull to the old soldier and myself, the man who had spoken before began. "Yesterday evening I saved my brother from the Cossacks, who had wounded and taken him prisoner. I must tell you about it, as it is a most wonderful story. The evening before the arrival at Kono, dying of cold and hunger and spent with fatigue, I wandered from the road with 2 officers of the 71st, armed, like myself, with muskets, to find some village in which we could spend the night. But after having walked about half a league, we were able to go no further without running the risk of perishing in the snow. So we decided to pass the night in a deserted, tumble-down house, where, most luckily, we found both wood and straw. And as I still had some flour left from Wilna, we made a good fire and had some broth. The next day, early in the morning, we set about finding our way back to the high road. But just as we were about to leave the house, we were surrounded by about 15 Cossacks. We stopped in front of the door to reconnoiter them. They made sign to us to approach, but we did the opposite. We re-entered the house, closed the door, and opening the 2 little windows began a fire, which made the Cossacks fly. At long musket shot they stopped, but we had reloaded our weapons and left the house, firing a second volley, at which a horse and rider fell. The latter freed himself of the horse and left it. We set off at our quickest pace, but had hardly taken 50 steps before we saw them bearing down upon us. Directly afterwards, they went to the right to pick up a portmanteau off the horse we had shot. Soon they were lost to sight, and we gained the road to Carno, which we were to reach that same day. We were now in the midst of over 6,000 stragglers, and, as it always happened amid this rubble, I was separated from my comrades. I walked all day, and it was hardly dark when I found myself near the Niemen, and about a league from Kuno. As there were houses to be seen on the other side, I decided to cross the river on the ice, so as to find a shelter, as I did the night before. On gaining the bank, I saw 2 or 3 houses about half a league to the right, where I was received fairly well by the peasants, and passed a quiet night. The next morning at daylight I took to the road to rejoin the column on the other side of Kono, but hardly had I gone a couple of 100 steps when I was suddenly surrounded by a dozen Cossacks who, without doing me any harm or even thinking of disarming me, made me march in front of them in exactly the direction I had wanted to take. I was a prisoner, though I could not realize it. After an hour's walking, we came to a village. There I was relieved of my arms and of my money. But I was lucky enough to save some pieces of gold hidden in the lining of my waistcoat. I took off my shako and covered my head with a cap of black sheepskin I had found. I noticed that the Cossacks were laden with gold and silver, and that they did not pay much attention to me, so I decided to take the first opportunity of escaping. It might have been about 10 o'clock when we left the village. We met another detachment of Cossacks escorting prisoners, some of whom were men belonging to the Imperial Guard, taken in the sortie from Kono. I was placed among these. We marched, with frequent stoppages, till about 3 o'clock. I noticed that the leader was uncertain of the way, not knowing the country. Before nightfall, we had reached a little village and were put into a barn, where we all went through a very minute inspection. I trembled for my gold, but I trembled for nothing. The search was barely over when I heard my name called by a prisoner unknown to me. "Here," I answered. Another prisoner at the far end answered too. Then, moving in the direction whence the voice had come, I asked who answered to the name of Dassonville. "I," replied my brother, whom you see here. Think of our surprise on finding each other. We embraced, weeping. He told me that he had been wounded in the leg on November 28th near the Berezina bridge. I told him my plan was to make our escape before they forced us to recross the Niemen. For being now in Pomerania, a country belonging to Prussia, we must take the opportunity that offered. The peasants brought us potatoes and water, a piece of good luck we were far from expecting. They were distributed among us, 4 for each of us. We threw ourselves upon them ravenously, and almost all declared that just then it was better to be a prisoner, eating potatoes, than to be free, but dying of hunger and cold on the high road. But I said that, all the same, it would be better to get out of their clutches. "Who knows? I said that they will not take us to Siberia." I showed them a possibility of escape, for close to where I was lying beside my brother, I had found out a place where, by taking down 2 boards, we could get out easily. They agreed with me. But an hour afterwards, as ill luck would have it, we were told we must leave. Night had come on. Many of the men, worn out with fatigue, had fallen asleep. The Cossacks, seeing their orders were not obeyed quickly, struck those still lying down with the knot. They would have struck my brother, who could not rise quickly enough because of his wound, but I placed myself before him and warded off the blows, meanwhile helping him to rise, and instead of leaving the barn like the others, we hid ourselves behind the door, and were lucky enough not to be seen. The Cossacks and all the prisoners were gone. We did not dare to breathe. 3 Cossacks on horseback crossed the barn at a gallop, looking to right and left to see if there was anyone left. When they had gone, I dragged myself along to peep outside. I saw a peasant coming and crept back to my place. He entered the barn on the side opposite to us. We had just time to cover ourselves with straw. Very luckily for us, he did not see us and shut the 2 doors. We were now alone. It might have been 6 o'clock. We rested for another hour, and then I rose to open the door, but I couldn't manage it, so I had to return to my first project, that of getting out by removing the 2 boards. This I did. I told my brother to wait for me, and got out. I went as far as the entrance to the village. At the first house, I saw a light coming through a window, and peeping in, there were 3 great Cossack rascals counting money at a table, a peasant holding a light for them. I was just going back to rejoin my brother in the barn when I saw one of them make a movement towards the door, open it, and come out. Luckily for me, a sledge laden with wood was near, so I lay flat on my stomach in the snow behind it. The Cossack then re-entered the house and closed the door. Instantly, I rose to fly, but afraid of being seen, instead of crossing in front of the window, I took a turn to the right. I hadn't gone 10 steps when a door opened, and to escape notice, I crept into a stable and hid myself under the trough from which the horses were eating. I had hardly done so when a peasant entered with a lantern, followed by a Cossack. I thought it was all over with me. The Cossack was carrying a portmanteau. He fastened it upon his horse and went out, closing the door. I was just going myself when I thought of taking a horse with me. As quickly as possible, I seized the one with the portmanteau, but in turning his head round to get him out of the stable, something fell on my shoulder. It was the Cossack's lance propped up against his horse. I took it away with me for defense and went out. I reached the barn, helped my brother to mount, and taking the bridle in my hand, proceeded in the direction of the road. When we had gone a couple of 100 steps, I looked round to see if anything was coming. I handed my brother the Cossack's lance and covered him with the great camel's hair cape that I found on the horse. After half an hour's walking, we reached the road. Then, turning in the direction of Gombinen, we saw some peasants busy removing the wheels of a deserted wagon. To avoid passing near them, we took a road to our left, leading to the entrance of a village. We wished we could have avoided the village, so fearful were we of falling again into the enemy's clutches. God only knows what would have happened to us for seeing us with a horse and weapon belonging to one of their people. They would have made sure we had killed the owner. We had stopped to consult when we heard a noise behind us. We thought at once of flight, but there was no chance, for the masses of snow on each side of the road prevented our getting into the ditches. Our situation became critical, and I did not dare tell my fears to my brother on account of his wound. We were starting again straight on when we saw in front of us the cause of our fright. Some men only a few steps away from us. They came to a stop, calling to us in German, "Good evening, friend Cossacks." "Listen," I said to my brother, "you are a Cossack, and I am your prisoner. You can speak a little German, so only keep cool." As he had only a dilapidated sergeant's cap upon his head, I exchanged it for mine, which was like a Cossack's. We recognized these people for the peasants we had seen a while before, busy around the wheel on the road. There were 4 of them, dragging 2 of the wheels behind them with ropes. My brother inquired if there were any fellow Cossacks in the village. They said, "No." "Then," said he, "take me to the burgomaster, for I am cold and hungry, besides being wounded and obliged to look after this French prisoner." One of them then told us that they had been waiting for the Cossacks since morning, and that they would have done well to come, for more than 30 Frenchmen had lodged with them the previous night, and they had almost all of them been disarmed as they were leaving. On hearing this, we wished ourselves at the devil, but just then some more peasants came up, who, seeing me being led by a Cossack, threatened and insulted me. They were reproved by an old man, who, I learned afterwards, was a Protestant minister, the curé of the place. We were led before the burgomaster, who made my brother exceedingly welcome, telling him that he should be quartered with him and his horse taken care of. But as for the Frenchman, he would have him sent to the prison. "That is to say," he said, "if you do not want to keep him about you as a servant." "I would like that," answered my brother, "especially as I am wounded, and this Frenchman is a surgeon major. He will dress my leg." "Surgeon major," replied the burgomaster. "That is lucky, for we have here a good fellow in the village, who had his arm broken this morning by a Frenchman. The sergeant major will set his arm for him. We were taken into a very warm room, where there was a bed intended for the Cossack. But he refused it, and asked for some straw for himself and some for me, which he had put to one side so as not to awaken suspicion. For Brother Cossack, they brought bread, lard, sauerkraut, beer and gin, potatoes and water for me. The burgomaster showed my brother a quantity of weapons in a corner of the room. They had belonged to the Frenchmen whom the peasants had disarmed that morning. There were pistols, carbines, 5 or 6 muskets, as well as cavalry swords and several packets of cartridges. While we were at our meal, a peasant, with his arm in a sling, entered the room, accompanied by a woman. It was the man with the broken arm. He came and sat down near me, so I decided to go in for bravado. I asked for linen bandages and a little splint of pine wood. The arm was broken clean between the wrist and the elbow. During the last 5 years, I had seen so many operations that I did not hesitate to set to work. There was no wound to be seen. I signed to a peasant to hold the sick man by the shoulders and to the wife to hold his hand. Then I set, and pretty well too, I think, the broken bone, just as I should have set a piece of wood. To begin with, I felt my way a little, while the devil of a fellow shouted and made villainous faces. Then I applied compresses sprinkled with schnapps, afterwards 4 splints, that I bound up with linen bandages. The man felt better and told me I was a good fellow. His wife and the burgomaster complimented me, and I was able to breathe. They gave me a large glass of gin to reward me. But this was not all. The burgomaster gave me to understand I must go and see a woman who for the last few days had been suffering horribly. It was a case of a young woman in labor. They had been to Kono for an accoucheur, but all was in such disorder because of the Russians and French that one could not be found. As a general thing, he said, it is a service the old women render, but it seems this is a complicated case. I tried to make the burgomaster understand that, having lost my surgical instruments, I could undertake no operation, that moreover I was no accoucheur. I understood nothing about it. But I couldn't make myself understood. They thought it was simply ill will on my part. I was obliged to go. Conducted by 2 peasants and 3 women, I was led to the end of the village. I do not know if it was my having left such a warm room, but I was as cold as death. Finally, we reached the place. I was taken into a room where I found 3 old women, just like the 3 fates. They were around a young woman lying on a bed, who was shrieking every now and again a great deal louder than the man with the broken arm. One of the old women took me up to the sick woman, and a second lifted the coverlet. Imagine my embarrassment. Saying nothing, I looked at the 3 old crones, to gather from their looks what they wanted me to do. But they were waiting likewise, looking at me to see what I intended. The sick woman too had her eyes fixed upon me. Finally I understood one of the old women to say I must find out whether the child still lived. I made up my mind and placed my great paw, as cold as ice, on the patient. The touch made her leap up and utter a scream enough to make the house shake. This cry was followed by a second. The 3 old cronies seized her, and in less than 5 minutes all was over. A Prussian subject was born. Then, proud of my fresh cure, I rubbed my hands, and as I knew what was usual in my village under similar circumstances, the infant being bathed in warm water and wine, I ordered some to be brought in a basin. Afterwards I asked for some schnapps. They gave me a bottle full of it. I tasted it several times, then, taking a piece of linen, which I wetted in the warm water, I sprinkled the schnapps upon it, and applied the compress to the patient, who was feeling extremely comfortable, and who thanked me, pressing my hand. I left, escorted by the 2 men who had brought me and by 2 of the old duennas. I was reconducted before the burgomaster and praised up to the skies. My Cossack brother had been in a fearful fright, but was delighted to see me again. I had still 1 wounded man to patch up, and that was himself. I bathed the wound with warm water and dressed it with a little more knowledge of what I was about. We were left alone. When I was certain that everyone was asleep, I picked out 2 pairs of pistols, as well as a beautiful infantry sword and 2 lots of cartridges of the right size for our pistols. We took the precaution to load these at once. Mine were hidden while awaiting the time of our departure, and then we rested. In the morning, they brought us something to eat. This time, I was treated to the same food as the Cossack. While we were breakfasting, the burgomaster complimented me on my skill, asked me if I would like to remain with them, and said that he would give me one of his daughters in marriage. I told him that that could not be, as I was already married and had children. Then, turning to the Cossack, he asked him in what direction he was going. I am going to rejoin my brother and my comrades, who are following the road to the town. I do not remember its name, but it is the first I should come to along the road. I know, said the burgomaster. You mean Wilbalin? Well, we will go together. I will guide you to a place about a league from here, where you will find more than 200 Cossacks. For I have just received orders to send there everything in the way of hay and flour, and to follow afterwards myself. We will set out in half an hour. I will get your horse ready with my own. Hardly had he gone from the room when I thrust my pistol into my belt and about 30 cartridges into my pockets. My Cossack brother fastened on the sword I had chosen for him and also put a pair of pistols in his belt. A moment afterwards they came to tell us that all was ready for our departure. I took the Cossack's portmanteau and we went out. That concludes the 21st part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.